The reign of Napoleon Bonaparte, the most famously short man in European history and a general and military strategist of epic proportions, if you will, pardon the pun, in relation to his size, began with what is called the Thermidorian reaction to the French Revolution. It is called the Thermidorian reaction because it occurred during the month of Thermidor under the new calendar created during the radical phase of the French Revolution. And to refer to something as a Thermidorian reaction means to say it brought about an immediate cooling off. It goes from hot to cold very, very fast. And following the execution of Maximilien Robespierre, there was a Thermidorian reaction to the French Revolution. The revolution cooled off immediately. The radical phase ended abruptly. The committees of public safety had their power curtailed significantly. Freedom to worship was instituted. Laissez-faire economic policies were restored. A new constitution was established with an elected legislature, and this new constitution had very high property qualifications for voting, and so it essentially created, again, a very bourgeois friendly kind of government. You go all the way back to the original moderate revolution. Well, this new government, this new constitution, was led by an executive group, a small group of men that was called the Directory. And the Directory ruled France from 1795, until 1799. So it had quite a long reign, but this was an extremely unpopular government. The revolution was unpopular. No one wanted to go back to the craziness of that, but the Directory was unpopular as well. Economic growth stagnated. The Directory was corrupt. People were unhappy. They didn't want the revolution. They didn't want the Directory. They didn't know what they wanted. It created a situation which was absolutely ripe for someone like Napoleon to take over, which he did. When political unrest between royalists, those who favored a return to the monarchy, and the Jacobin, who had gone underground again, they had been banned, but they continued to be a thing. When that surfaced and it proved too much for the Directory to handle, this created a situation for Napoleon Bonaparte to step in, and he did. Napoleon had become a very famous general during the French Revolutionary Wars. He was in very many ways a beneficiary of the French Revolution. Napoleon was born the son of minor noblemen. He was actually Italian by birth, but born on the island of Corsica, which was a French possession. And because of the revolution, he was able to be trained as a military officer, and he was able to rise through the ranks of the French army based upon his talent and skill. And he was a very intelligent and very talented soldier. He was a gift for military strategy, and he excelled and really proved himself during the French Revolutionary Wars, and he rose through the ranks, and he became a very popular general. And in 1797, in a really sound defeat of the Austrians, Napoleon became a national hero in France. And so in 1799, he capitalized upon his popularity, and he seized power from the Directory, which had become very unpopular at that time. And he took control of the French government. In 1801, he declared himself consul, C-O-N-S-U-L. In 1802, he declared himself consul for life, and in 1804, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon I. And by that time, France had come full circle from 1789 and the absolute monarchy of Louis XVI to 1804 and the reign of the Emperor Napoleon I. Napoleon was an interesting man. Like was noted before, in many ways, he, as an intelligent and talented individual, was in very many ways a true beneficiary of the reforms of the French Revolution. However, he was not a Jacobin. He was not a sans-culotte. Napoleon was a believer in the revolution, but only in so much as it allowed people to advance on their talent, to advance on their merit. Napoleon was very much a pragmatist, and he was not a believer in, I would say, social equality. He was not about putting the top on the bottom and the bottom on the top, but he was a believer in legal equality, and he was incredibly charismatic and incredibly smart. And this is what really led him in his rise to power. This is a portrait of Josephine, Napoleon's wife. The story of Napoleon and Josephine is one of the great love stories in world history. And I say great meaning it's big, it's well known, it's certainly very, very interesting. Josephine was a widow of an aristocratic French nobleman. She was a woman of bad reputation, however, and the love between Napoleon and Josephine was a tempestuous one. It was a dramatic one. If you have had the misfortune to be a part of a relationship or to know couples where they love each other and they hate each other, that was Napoleon and Josephine. But Napoleon married her at the height of his military career before he became emperor. In fact, he crowned her Empress of France, but she proved to be, I should say, something of a drag on him. Josephine had a reputation as something of a loose woman. She was considerably older than Napoleon at the time of their marriage. And so she proved, even though he loved her very much and he hated her very much, and they certainly had lots of drama in their relationship, she proved something of a liability to him, but she also proved something in someone that he could never quite bring himself to be rid of. Anyway, she's a very interesting person, and the story of their relationship is incredibly interesting too, if you ever feel inclined to look into that. Napoleon and Josephine lived in a mansion in Paris, and Napoleon acquired a great deal of property around that mansion, and he built her a zoo. Josephine loved animals, and he built her a zoo in the woods around their house. And so, this is the kind of interesting stories that there are about them. As noted previously, Napoleon was a very practical guy, and this is true in a lot of ways that we'll talk about more specifically, but I really like this quote to illustrate that. Napoleon was really very political, and he was all about power, and he was all about using the resources available to him to advance his agenda, and I think that this quote really illustrates that. It is by making myself Catholic that I brought peace to Brittany and the Vendée, where the great counter-revolutionary rebellion had taken place. It is by making myself Italian that I won minds in Italy. Some of Napoleon's greatest military successes came on the Italian peninsula against the Austrians. It is by making myself a Muslim that I established myself in Egypt. It was Napoleon who went all the way to Egypt. He's credited with discovering the Rosetta Stone, etc. If I governed a nation of Jews, I should reestablish the Temple of Solomon, the great Jewish temple that was destroyed in the Assyrian assault upon the city of Jerusalem way back in the day, hundreds of years BC. What this very clearly illustrates, this quote of Napoleon's, that he was a man who was practical and did what he had to do to advance his agenda. He was who he needed to be, and he did the things that he needed to do. This is one of many portraits of Napoleon completed by the neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David. I hope that you will remember David as from when you looked at neoclassicism in the last unit. David was a great neoclassical painter, and he is perhaps the most important painter of this era. You can look through his painting as documentation of the French Revolution. And even though David was something of a radical revolutionary, he himself had been a Jacobin and had been quite involved in revolutionary activity in France, David, because of his skill and because of his talent as an artist, became the court painter of Napoleon, and he painted many portraits of Napoleon, and he was certainly Napoleon's favorite artist, and this portrait was Napoleon's favorite portrait. Here he is as the war hero. Here he is as the great military commander. Notice down here on the stone it says Bonaparte, the family name of Napoleon. In works of art, a military leader who is painted on a horse to denote their command. And Napoleon is certainly very forward-looking. You'll notice that his arm is up. You'll also notice that he's climbing uphill. He is climbing the mountain. And if you look in the background here, there are the soldiers and the artillery being moved. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. But, well, now we're on this slide. The soldiers and the artillery being moved, moving up the hill, the fearless leader of the people in the uphill battle. Napoleon had many great successes with his domestic policies, and one of the great debates in all of history is whether or not Napoleon advanced or hindered the goals of the Enlightenment and the goals of the French Revolution. Napoleon, like I said, was a practical guy, and very much like Henry of Navarre, who said Paris is well worth a mass, one of the first things that Napoleon did after becoming consul was to make nice, if you will, with the Catholic Church. The Concordat of 1801, please note this is even before Napoleon becomes emperor. It's very early in his tenure of power. The Concordat of 1801 was an official agreement that Napoleon signed with Pope Pius the Eighth, and this officially ended the hostility between the French government and the Catholic Church that had emerged during the French Revolution as a result of the civil constitution of the clergy and the dechristianization of France. Under the Concordat of 1801, the Catholic Church was forced to essentially recognize some of the goals and results, I would say, of the French Revolution, most notably the legal existence in France at this time under Napoleon's rule of full religious toleration. However, the Catholic Church did retain under the Concordat its official position, or its position as the official religion of France. And so this painting is denoting that, the Blessed Mother with the cross, and you see the men of church and state signing the Concordat below. And Napoleon was Catholic. He was baptized Catholic. He was raised Catholic. Nobody really knows for sure if he was religious or not. He certainly was quite skeptical. We do know that. He was quite skeptical about religion, but there were many times he really showed a great and deep faith as well. But this Concordat is really a means to an end. France was a Catholic country, and the first thing that Napoleon does as leader of France is to make nice with the Catholic Church, to restore good relations with the Catholic Church, and that is what the Concordat does. But while it does recognize the position of the Catholic Church within France, the official religion of France, it also forces the Catholic Church to be at peace with, I guess I should say, the existence of full religious toleration in France as well. Napoleon's domestic policies are contained in what is called the Code Napoleon, or the Napoleonic Code, and it's a codified series of civil laws that established what was, believe it or not, the first unified legal code in France. One law, genuine, true civil law for the entire nation, was not open to interpretation. The Code Napoleon was based upon Enlightenment ideas. This is a very Enlightenment-based code of laws. It was predicated upon the notion of equality under the law and the advancement in society based upon talent and merit, and very important components of the Code Napoleon. Very much you're equal at birth and you advance based upon your talent. It recognized laissez-faire based economic principles. It restricted guilds. It set or enforced standard weights and measures. It allowed for freedom of choice in occupation. It also resulted in the more efficient collection of taxes and administration of government. So the Code Napoleon, in a lot of ways, is a very Enlightenment-friendly legal set of laws, and it's the first unified law of France, full religious toleration. And it established one of the things that Napoleon did under the Code Napoleon and during his reign is he did not abandon the idea of aristocracy, because Napoleon was not somebody who was all about social equality and everyone is exactly the same. He did believe some people were better than others. However, because of how he had benefited from the revolution and because he portrayed himself as a hero of the revolution, as a protector of the revolution, he established this aristocracy in France that was an aristocracy based upon merit. You could enter the aristocracy via achievement, via talent, via merit. It wasn't an aristocracy based upon birth. And this was a very popular part, I guess I would say, of Napoleon's code. Napoleon's code was really helpful in terms of improving France's economic situation, in involving France in the in industry and the Industrial Revolution to an extent. The only group that the Code Napoleon was not particularly good for was women. Napoleon wasn't really someone who liked women very much. He did like women in the sexual sense, but he didn't really like women. Josephine did him wrong, let's just say, to put it lightly. He kind of looked at women as being morally inferior, as being creatures of vice, etc. He just didn't think they were very, very good people. And he really demanded under his government that women were subjugated to men. And so while women didn't advance greatly during the French Revolution, they did advance some, as we discussed in class. And the Napoleonic Code reversed all of those. Legally, it took women back to the status of children. They retained, or they had under the Napoleonic Code, the legal status of children. That meant essentially they couldn't do anything, even as an adult, they couldn't do anything without the permission of their father or husband. They could not testify in court. Their testimony wouldn't be taken as equal to that of a man, etc. They lost their right to divorce, etc. So Napoleon reversed many of the, under the Code Napoleon. While it is often considered a very Enlightenment-based legal code, it was not good for the women of France at the time. It reversed what gains they had made during the French Revolution. In his foreign policy, Napoleon was quite aggressive. He believed that Europe should be united under one ruler. He's really kind of like a Holy Roman Emperor kind of guy. We're going to unite Europe under one ruler, and of course Napoleon believed that that ruler should be him. And he was an incredibly successful general in command of a large and incredibly successful army, and his foreign policy was really quite successful as well. As you can see from this map, by 1812, Napoleon had essentially taken control of all of the European continent and even some of the Scandinavian countries. In the dark blue territories that you see here, comes down into Italy, etc. These were directly controlled under the French government. They were considered part of France. They were under Napoleon's direct control. These light blue areas here were controlled by Napoleon, though not directly. Napoleon practiced a policy of nepotism. Nepotism means to officially favor members of your family. Its root word is based on the Latin word for nephew. And he didn't give these territories to his nephews to govern, but he gave them to his brothers. And so the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the Confederation of the Rhine, Spain, Napoleon officially coronated his brothers as the kings, dukes, etc. of these areas. The pink areas that you see were allies of France. Allies, I'm making quotation marks in the air right now. Allies, they weren't officially taken over. Napoleon did not depose their monarchs and instate one of his brothers as monarchs there. So he left the ruling structure intact, but it was really kind of one of those things where it's like, I'm going to let you be, but you're really going to listen to me and you're going to do what I say. In fact, one of the reasons Austria remained outside the official French Empire, one of the reasons that Austria remained somewhat independent, though not very closely tied ally, was because Napoleon, as emperor after 1804, Josephine was older than Napoleon by quite a few years, and became quite apparent rather early in their marriage that she was not going to produce an heir. She was not going to produce a child for Napoleon. She did have children by her first marriage, but she was unable to conceive a child for Napoleon. And Napoleon was like, hey, I'm the emperor. I need an heir. Sound like somebody else we know. And so he divorced Josephine, which is something he had been close to doing for many years because she had been unfaithful, etc. But he divorced Josephine. He sent her to a convent out in the countryside, and he married, as part of a treaty with the Austrian government, he married a young Habsburg princess, a very young Habsburg princess, and she's only 17 or 18 years old at the time of their marriage, to solidify their alliance. She very quickly produced a male child for Napoleon, and Napoleon very quickly grew tired of her. And once he had his child, was kind of done with her. But this is how his empire looked. And you see, even going into Russia, the green, not official allies, etc., but very much under the influence of Napoleon. Now, the power of Napoleon seemed invincible. The power of Napoleon seemed absolute, but that was not necessarily the case. Napoleon spread, as part of the Napoleonic Wars, as part of his message. Remember, he considers himself a son of the revolution. He considers himself a defender of the revolution, a protector of the revolution. And so part of what he does everywhere that he goes and everywhere that he imposes his rule is to impose the Code Napoleon, to impose these revolutionary ideas, to impose these ideas of equality under the law, of advancement based on merit and talent, of nationalism. Napoleon was a general, and he was a huge proponent of and a master exploiter of nationalism. And nationalism really came to be one of the things that turned around and bit Napoleon in the butt. Very hard to dominate and to control other nations, and at the same time spread or instill the value of nationalism. This is a painting called the 3rd of May. We'll look at this again a little bit later on when we study art, but this painting commemorates the assassination of nationalist rebels in Spain. Spain was under the control of one of Napoleon's brothers, and the Spanish in 1808, in a nationalist uprising, they rose up against French domination of Spain. And here we have the rebels being killed. And notice the figure in the middle, right here, how Christ-like he looks. The light is on him. His arms are extended, almost like he's on the crucifix. And you will notice he's unarmed and he's rather normal looking. And then over here we have the French soldiers who are at close and at point blank range and armed, and you can kind of see the inherent violence and injustice that the artist is trying to portray. So nationalism really ended up being quite devastating to Napoleon because he could not get these other nations in Europe to accept him or members of his family as their rightful leaders. The real thorn in the side of Napoleon, however, was the British. The English, as we saw in class, despised the revolution and everything that was happening in France, and they really hated Napoleon. If you ever go to England, ask somebody what they think of Napoleon. I think the animosity lingers. They really hated Napoleon. They called him the mad little man or the crazy little man, and then you can throw some expletives in there too to know what they really thought about him. Okay, they saw him as power hungry and threatening to everything that Europe was about, and threatening to England. This little cartoon from a British magazine called Punch shows the plum pudding in danger, the plum pudding, England's share. And so here we have the mad little man Napoleon over here, and he's trying to slice off the world. And here's the British general trying to preserve their share. But you'll notice here's little England left in the middle. England felt confident about their access to and their influence in the Western Hemisphere. They feared they had lost Europe to Napoleon, and here they were in the middle. What was going to happen to England? So England was not, the British were not a fan of Napoleon, and they fought him the entire way. They fought him the entirety, essentially, of his reign in France and throughout Europe. It became apparent fairly early on in Napoleon's reign that he was really going to struggle with the British. Great Britain is an island, and Great Britain in the early 19th century possessed the best and most powerful navy in the world. Napoleon possessed the best army. Not helpful, okay? Not helpful. And so there was a mismatch there. And the British, despite Napoleon's best efforts, refused to engage him on land and only engaged him on sea. And he would lose when he engaged the British on sea. This painting right here commemorates a great defeat of the French Navy by the British at Trafalgar. Trafalgar is right off the southern coast of Spain, and it was a tremendous defeat of the French by the British, by the Lord Admiral Nelson. If you've ever been to London, they have a huge public square called Trafalgar Square. They have a huge obelisk in that square with a beautiful statue of the Lord Admiral Nelson on the top of it. Like, they are still all about this victory over Napoleon. They loved it. And it really frustrated Napoleon. It really frustrated him. He understood that he was not, because he was a smart guy, he's a practical guy, he was not going to be able to beat the British on the sea. He had to beat them on the land. And the British were pretty smart too. So the British knew, hey, as long as we just fight naval battles, we're good. But we're not going to engage with the mad little man on land, because then they would lose. Napoleon's army was the best, and Napoleon was the best commander. Napoleon was actually a very forward-looking and visionary guy. What to do about England occupied a great deal of his time and his thought, and he understood the fundamental problem. I can't fight them with the Navy, and they will not fight me on land, so what to do? And he really has some very forward-looking ideas. He considered, for example, the idea of using balloons to lift his army across the British Channel over to England. Hot air balloons were not invented yet, but they were on their way. Not a very efficient way to move your army, but a very visionary kind of idea. He also explored the possibility of, and actually had French engineers begin digging a tunnel under the English Channel so that they could move the horses and soldiers of the French army to the United Kingdom under the English Channel. This did not come to bear, but you know, of course, that the channel exists now, that this was something that was to come. So Napoleon was really quite a forward-looking and visionary guy. But he couldn't make his balloon idea or his tunnel idea a reality. And so what Napoleon tried in desperation in 1810 was what he called his continental system. And what you see on this dotted red line here around the map was an embargo that Napoleon put in place. An embargo is a formal refusal of trade, if you will. And so what the continental system required was that nobody in continental Europe was to conduct any commerce with Great Britain. The whole point of the continental system was to bring England to its knees economically. We will talk next week about the Industrial Revolution. Well, England was much further along in industrialization than continental Europe at this time, but trade was incredibly important to everyone's economy. And Napoleon's thinking, and it really wasn't a bad thought, was that if he prohibited France and the rest of his empire from purchasing goods made in England, that England would be so devastated economically that they'd get off his back, that they would capitulate. It really wasn't a bad idea, but it misfired terribly. It backfired terribly in that England was able to withstand the embargo better than continental Europe was. Did it hurt England? It certainly did, but England had strong economic ties with the United States and with India and other countries outside of Europe at this time, which kind of got it through the embargo. But other countries of Europe were devastated by the lack of trade with England. And so at the end of the day, what Napoleon underestimated was how much Europe needed England for their economic prosperity. And so the continental system was a disaster. In 1812, what became Napoleon's ruin occurred. He invaded Russia. The reason Napoleon invaded Russia was because Russia was not cooperating with the continental system, and Napoleon felt that it was incumbent upon him to invade to kind of show them who was in charge and that they needed to cooperate with what he wanted to do, that they had to follow his orders. And Russia was disobeying the continental system, was bucking it because they had to, because they were really devastated economically by the lack of trade with Great Britain. And so Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, and he penetrated his army very far into Russia and was initially successful, but Napoleon became the first victim of what would become, a few really notorious victims of Russian military strategy, which was essentially to advance or to retreat your army in front of the invading army and draw them into the interior of the very large country and just let winter take over. And that's essentially what happened to Napoleon's army. If you looked at them on paper, they should have won. If the Russian army had ever turned around and given fight, they would have won, but they retreated in front of the French army. They drew the French army into the interior of the country. They waited for General Winter to arrive, and General Winter decimated the French army. And in 1813, Napoleon was forced to return to France in humiliation and really just in destruction. His army was decimated in Russia. He had taken to Russia an army of 600,000 men. He returned to Russia he returned to France from Russia in disgrace with an army of only 40,000 men. The very, very high casualties were from the weather. They were from the weather and the elements. They were not from the Russian army. But the French were utterly, utterly defeated. Napoleon's great defeat earned him the ire of the people, and he was sent into exile. He was deposed as emperor and sent into exile on the island of Elba. I want to point this out to you. Here it is. Let me see. Let me turn that on. All right. Tiny little Elba. Look at it right there. It's so close to France. It's tiny. He was guarded by the French there, and this was really a whole government in exile. He really retained a great deal of power. People came to see him all the time. He wasn't guarded all that seriously. In the meantime, in 1814, King Louis XVII, the Bourbon monarchy, was restored. Nobody was really excited about that. Well, the royalists were pretty excited about that, but most people in France weren't really excited about that. They were going along with it. France was rather confused, I guess, at the time about what they wanted. They didn't want the revolution. They didn't want the Directory. They were mad at Napoleon for losing in Russia. They really didn't want the Bourbons back. Napoleon remained in Elba. In 1814, the Bourbon monarchy was restored in France. In 1814, in Vienna, Austria, a Congress of European leaders convened, and this will be very important on the subject of our next series of notes. They're going to they're going to plot out what Europe looks like, what they do in response to the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon is in Elba getting grumpier and grumpier and grumpier until he decides in 1815 in May that enough is enough and he's going to go back, and he escapes and he comes back to France and he lands at Marseille and he begins what is called his 100 days, his empire of 100 days. He marches north. Whoops. The people join him because they love him so much, and they're just really not impressed with this Bourbon king who has come back. The king flees. Woo, he's out. And Napoleon is marching north, and he has reclaimed his power. In the meantime, you have all of these heads of state and others who are meeting at Vienna, and they are like, absolutely not. We are not dealing with the mad little man anymore. And so, led by the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, they gather their forces. Napoleon is marching north. They gather their forces. They come together, and in the summer of 1815, they all meet at the town or near the town of Waterloo. The rest of the Europeans have had it with Napoleon. They're not going to tolerate this resurgence, if you will. And at Waterloo, Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon had a great army, he had a disciplined army. He actually, it was a spectacular defeat. He was absolutely crushed at Waterloo. But what happened was, because you had an Austrian and a British and a Prussian forces converging, they decided to split the force and to wait and to see what Napoleon would do. And so you had about, half of the army way over to the west, and the rest of the army to the north and the east. And so when Napoleon, who was marching north, he sent his reconnaissance officers up to see what was going on, they missed the army that was hiding over to the west. And so the report back to Napoleon was that the army that was waiting for them was only about half the size it actually was. And so what happened at Waterloo was Napoleon engaged this army. He engaged them head on. He fought them fiercely. And the army, because they were divided, the army that was over to the west swooped around. They enclosed, they encircled the French army. Napoleon was captured over the course of 3 very fierce days of fighting, in which very high casualties were accrued on all sides. It was a really devastating battle. The French were absolutely humiliated. They were absolutely defeated. In fact, the phrase Waterloo, and it's used all the time in popular culture or lingo as an allusion to total defeat. The French were totally defeated. Napoleon was captured, and he was kept alive on purpose. The British especially, and the Austrians and Prussians, were not going to make a martyr out of him. And so in Waterloo, Napoleon's triumphant return went down in absolutely flaming defeat. The leader of the army at Waterloo was the British General Lord Arthur, the Duke of Wellington. He remains perhaps the greatest British hero ever because he defeated Napoleon. The Brits weren't taking any chances this time. They did not give Napoleon back to the French. They exiled him themselves to the island of St. Helena, where he was kept in absolute seclusion under British guard for the rest of his life. Now, if you'll think back to the map I showed you with Elba, where he went on his first exile, so close to France. Here's St. Helena. This is the continent of Africa. And here is St. Helena. It is so little that you can't even see it underneath that star there. So there is, and he was under British guard, not French. There is going to be no returning to France in glory. Napoleon was kept absolutely secluded. He didn't live very many more years. And he was buried on the island of St. Helena. Even after he died a few years later, the British refused to return his remains to France for fear that he would be treated as a martyr, treated as a hero. But in part of a treaty that was concluded in the 1840s, the remains of Napoleon were returned to France. And this is a photograph of his grave at the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris. It's really, really beautiful and spectacular, as you can see here. The French have memorialized him and continue to remember him as a great military hero. Definitely an interesting and controversial person in history.